Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in this world. And welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, moderator for today's event, and I welcome you. We have a great webinar on tap, but before we get started, I do have a few housekeeping items I need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the event, please know that you will be able to access it on demand once the event is finished. We'll be sending out an email that will have a link to access the webinar on demand. And we are also taking questions from the audience. So if you have a question at any time during the event, just use your GoToWebinar control panel, submit your questions, and I will take probably about 15 minutes so near the end and go through those. Okay, with that, we'll go ahead and kick off today's webinar, Developing a Testing Strategy for DevOps Success. Our speaker today is Ryan Yackel, who is Director of Product Development at QA Symphony. Hi, Ryan, welcome.
Hey, how are you doing today?
Doing great, thanks. How are you?
Oh, just fantastic. Had about 2 cups of coffee today. Got a good night's sleep. Kids didn't keep me up, so I'm ready to
All
go.
right. Excellent. Well, then with that, I'm going to go ahead and let you take over and do your thing.
All right, thanks, Charlene. Thank you all again for joining this webinar. We're gonna have a fun time today. I like to keep everything moving relatively fast, so if you have questions, go ahead and throw those questions in as I go along here. And if there is a question that pops up, I may answer it as we're going through, but we'll probably hold those till the end. And just a little bit of a time check. I know everyone has to get to meetings probably 5 minutes before, so we'll try to end around 11:55 to get everyone to their next meeting and get on that all-important conference call that you have to go to. Okay, so who is this guy? So my name is Ryan Yackel, and I am the Director of Product Development over here at QA Symphony. I think it's always important to kind of give a little bit of backstory on the person you're listening to on a webinar in case you think that they're weird or you think you need to actually be able to communicate and sync up with them. It's always good to have that background. So, from a testing experience side, I actually came from the testing space. I was a test automation engineer over at CGI Group. When I first started out, I graduated from college, had a lot of experience with Selenium, and at the time when QTP was kind of all the rage, I was a junior automator there. Then I moved on to Macy Systems and Technology as an enterprise test lead. So I always like to talk about how I was the person in charge of testing all of the furniture that got shipped to your house. If you ever bought anything at Bloomingdale's or Macy's and it never arrived at your house, you could probably blame me maybe for not testing it properly. I'm just kidding. No, but that's the systems I actually was overseeing and testing there. Then I really just like specialty coffee, superheroes, any of that stuff that is kind of the rage nowadays with specialty coffee, paying way too much for coffee, and also superheroes. The other thing is I do have a family. I've got 2 kids, Winnie and Rosalie. We dress up as Bob's Burgers for last Halloween. And obviously I'll entertain my wife by putting on certain face masks as she sees fit to kind of bond with her. So a little bit about me to kind of connect over. I know it's hard to always connect over a webinar with your presenter. Okay, so here's what we're gonna do. Here's the agenda. We gotta figure out and talk about what's going on in the industry, right? That's the first thing we gotta kind of cover. And some of it you all have heard before, but I'm gonna pull out some new reports that just came out and talk a little bit about some of that data and how that will frame the webinar experience that we're gonna talk to today. And then next thing is, what should we do, right? Out of this data, what's going on? What should we do with it? And then what are the next steps that we can take along with, we'll follow it up with some Q&A. So this is going to be a more of a concept type webinar. We're going to be speaking to a lot of those in management that are thinking about a lot of different trends going on in the industry and how to really adapt to those. And again, all these things I'm going to be talking about today, none of them are these things that are going to be super, prescribed methods where you go off, you do this, and everything is solved, right? It's going to take a little bit of effort to kind of think through these and problem solve these, but we're going to talk a lot about those today. All right, so everyone kind of knows this, right? The world is changing, and it has changed to some degree, and change is already here. Brian Dawson, one of the guys over at CloudBees, gave a presentation at our Quality Jam user conference this past April, and one of the big things was around change that he talked about. And change is like it whether you're here or not, right? Everyone is in business is a software business. Open source is pretty much everywhere. If you're on this call and you're thinking about automation, you probably moved away from maybe using a lot of commercial tools. You're moving more towards open source because it just kind of makes sense, right? Everything is changing, and the reason why everything is changing is because you've got this rapid pace of development that's moving faster than ever, right? So if you look at organizations that are practicing agile development, that's up at 94%. That was back in a 2016 study with State of Agile. It's even higher than that now. You've got a lot of organizations that are planning to move over the next 12 months to do something around DevOps. And again, you look at these different reports, there's a lot of different things that you will come up. Some people say 71%, some people say 80%. All we know is that everyone wants to get on this train that revolves around DevOps. And the last thing is that the reason why people are wanting to do this is really looking at the number of deployments is exponentially higher when you look at those that are doing it for high performing organizations versus low performing organizations. So you have this speed that's going on that's just kind of out of control, right? And in an accelerating world, what's really interesting is if you look at, this is actually from a Fortune magazine survey of all the Fortune 500 CEOs. What they looked at was, hey, what's the thing that keeps you up at night? What are the things that you see as the actual challenge? And you've probably, as a director or as a manager, right, you've probably heard a top-down initiatives from your CEOs or CTOs or CIOs, right? When they're talking about what's really keeping them up, the main thing that's keeping them up is really around technology and how it is the greatest issue that's going on right now. This rapid pace of technology change is just like going crazy, and they're always worried about not only just the competition's rate of their technology, but their own technology and their own initiatives that they're doing, how fast that's actually moving. What's really interesting about this study is if you look back, I think it was in 2015, rapid pace of technology was number one. It was at 72%. However, it flipped in 2016 and cybersecurity got brought up. So what that tells me is that cybersecurity was kind of this thing where it's still, the top two things, but it really was, at the time of the survey that was going out, something probably happened in a data breach at a large company that made people then automatically think about cybersecurity, right? Cybersecurity is something that's on people's minds, but unless something like crazy happens that makes this big, huge announcement in the industry, right, around something that bad happened, that's something that will kind of point out and make them check, yes, cybersecurity is now an issue for us. But if you look at it, rapid pace of technology has not changed. That's usually the number one thing that's always going to be selected in this type of world. And the other thing that's going on is not only just the acceleration, but there's this explosion of all these modern technologies, right? You're using things like Jenkins for build tools, or using TeamCity, or you're looking at tracking tools like Jira and Atlassian software and Rally and version 1, and you're looking at different code deployment tools. There's all these things that are going out there around the entire software development lifecycle and this explosion of modern technology. And what it's done is it's made people think about, okay, how are we going to get to getting this stuff out faster? Because it used to be that back in the waterfall ages, really awesome, right? It was 1 to 4 releases a year, and it was pretty straightforward in this waterfall way, right? Nothing ever worked out correctly, as you imagine, because of all the issues around waterfall. I remember being on a project that was a waterfall project. I think it was like a 300-page requirements document, and it had about 9 to 10 months of a release plan. When I was a tester, we had about 4 weeks to test, and 6 months of it got taken up by requirements definitions, right? So we know why waterfall is bad. But we said, you know what, we're going to increase this, and we're going to go from, not 1 to 4 releases a year, but we're going to break this down. We're going to make it, 6 to 24 releases. Do about, one to 2 releases, per month, and get that kind of going, right? But then when DevOps came about, it was like, you know what, we're doing this great job with Scrum. We're doing this great job with making sure we have all this upstream Agile stuff going on. We're doing all these Kanban boards. We got these Scrum boards. We got daily stand-ups. What we really need to do is focus on the deployment of it and get it out even faster. So it's like, you know what, let's break down the barrier between our DevOps, our operations, our development organization, and get to where we're doing hundreds of releases a year. And all this is fueled by, having these faster cycle times and increased output to reduce waste. All this push towards getting stuff out has increased in automation. However, here's the other thing that's going on. You've got all these industries that are saying, yep, okay, we got to move to DevOps. Yep, we got this increase in automation, got to do it. Yep. But if you look at it, industry adoption is not the same. So if you think about the type of customer that you're dealing with, is it a customer-centric organization where you're really selling from business to consumer? Are you in the gaming industry? Are you in the high-tech industry? You're probably doing a lot of things around systems of engagement, and your adoption of DevOps is probably bigger than something necessarily like a governance organization like healthcare or insurance, right? Of course, there's different pockets in these organizations, but this industry adoption is not always equal. Yet, even though this industry adoption is not always equal, there's this one thing that people are wanting to really, really care about and really hone in on and figure out how can we maximize this, and that is speed. Everyone wants to get to speed, but quality is just kind of a maybe now. It's really interesting because if you think about it, you always said, okay, we got to make sure that stuff goes out to our products, everyone adopts it, everything's good, okay. But now it seems like speed has kind of replaced that, and we really want to figure out, okay, well, where's the quality mix and speed, and how's that going to go? So that's a little bit of industry background, but what else is going on? It's specifically related to the testing area in, let's say, a DevOps DevOps surveys or development surveys. What's actually going on in the testing? And here's some new reports that have just come out. So some of you might be using GitLab, you may be using GitHub, you may be having something like Bitbucket, right? Here's the deal. They did this new global developer report. This came out in this year, and what they found was that testing, this is developer stocking, this isn't testers, this is developer stocking, right? They found that the number one thing that they encounter with delays is testing. Developers will always refer back to and say testing is an issue in our deployments, right? We're doing too much manual testing, or automation is not optimized so we can get our testing out, right? Whereas management saw that there was actually a planning issue that was going on that caused the number one delay. So you have a connection between planning and testing as the two number one things, and they're pretty much by far, when you look at deploying to production or code reviews, they're pretty much way ahead when it comes to that, right? The other thing is that even though they see that there's this issue with testing and there's issue with planning, what they will say, an agreement on, is the fact that they believe that CI alleviates a lot of the developers in the development process. That's very important because we're going to talk about what type of testing strategies you can do to make sure your testing gets and coincides with the CI that everyone is really loving these days. The other thing is that testing is usually still siloed from your DevOps or Agile tool stack. This is a report from the version 1 12th state of Agile report, just came out. I went through it the other day. Really good stuff to take a look at. All these reports I'm referring to, I really encourage you all to go look at these because don't hear it from me. Actually, go read the reports; they're really good. But one of the things, if you take a look at, is if you take a look at on the left side, these are the tools that people actually use, right? And what I want to highlight here is that even though this was a state of Agile report and they're really focused on Agile tools, what you're seeing is that there is a pretty big significant number of people that are still using what we usually consider as more legacy tools like HP Quality Center, ALM. And what they're also not doing is they're not recommending those types of tools when they're actually using them. So if you look at the bottom half of this, you see that you've got teams and organizations that are using testing tools for Agile adoption, yet they're not recommending these same tools. And what they're really recommending are probably tools you all are using today, which are things like Atlassian's Jira, CA Agile Central version 1. Those are the tools that everyone is really going towards, but the testing part of that is still pretty much disconnected and siloed from the tool stack that is actually recommended in your organization. That's very important to kind of understand as you look at, what are some blockers in DevOps adoption. One thing is we got tool stacks and testing that aren't really connected with our product management solutions. The other thing that's going on is we're seeing lower test automation equals lower release cycles. This is a report that just came out from Sauce Labs. So Sauce Labs is this thing called Testing Trends of 2018. They've done it in 2017 and also 2016. And here's what's really interesting. If you look at this question here, it says, how often does your team typically deploy a new build? Well, if you look at it, back in 2016, it was on the up. It was okay. It was at 10% for hourly. Then in 2017, it went to 14%. So you think, okay, yeah, we're adopting deploying faster, right? But in 2018, you see this drop. You see this drop in people going, you know what? We're not deploying as much as we want to hourly. We're not deploying as much as we want to daily. We're actually increasing the time it takes to get to a production deployment. So now we're investing more, or we're seeing more weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, even less often than a month type of releases that are going on in this trend. And it's all because if you look at some of the data, one of the reasons is because the percentage of people that are talking about the automation that they're doing in a DevOps environment around testing, it's actually dropped. It went from 32% to 28%. And so the theory is, if you look at some of the correlations around, and there's some other data in this report too, I highly recommend you look at. If you look at some of the data around this, you're basically saying that lower levels of test automation could lead to lower levels of releases, slower releases in your team. And then the last one that we look at is really around the complexity around your test automation. This is a new report that QA Symphony actually did with TechWell. It's called the 2018 Evolution of Test Automation. Again, lots of good nuggets in here as well. Hopefully you're writing all of these down as I'm going through these, because I really want to help you guys find other avenues of data to take a look at. One of the big things that we found is that the landscape is getting more and more complex around your test automation frameworks and the tools that you're using. So for example, although most of the time everyone is using open source tools, around 83% said they are, 36% said they use them only exclusively. And so if you look at, there's also a lot of commercial tools that are in play that have a combination of use both open source and commercial tools. And this is important because I'll talk about kind of the complexity that's going on here and how we can look at having a solution that really will streamline the adoption of test automation tools in a DevOps environment. So to sum it all up, right, here's what you've got. You've got delays in tests and planning. You've got testing that's disconnected with the pipeline and agile tools, right? Looking back at the version 1 report earlier, you've got these low levels of test automation that are going on. That's a trend. It's almost stagnant. It's not really increasing from 2017 to 2018, as we see in the Sauce Labs report. Then we have this confusion around test optimization and automation around our report that we showed. There's all these different dispersed tools, right? And all that kind of leads into is testing kind of gets into that bottleneck that it is, right? As we go back and look at that GitLab report, right, everyone is still saying that testing is the #1 issue when it comes to delays in our release cycle. So the question is, well, what should we do, right? What should we do around this? I always like to show this graph because some of you all may be using Atlassian software, you may not be, but this is an Atlassian software graph. But what you notice is they took out all of their particular products and they showed in this ecosystem of what's going on here. And one of the things I want to show is that we need to radically think about what's going on when it comes to this particular loop that we always talk about. I'll use this loop later on to go through each of the stages and we'll talk about that. But here's what it's interesting that you'll see. Sometimes you'll see this loop and you go, oh, okay, continuous feedback, planning, building, continuous integration, deploy, operate. The continuous integration part sometimes gets replaced. And a lot of times when you look at it, you go, okay, what's kind of missing here? Well, what's missing, and you'll see these in different graphs that you'll see across the internet. If you Google the DevOps infinite loop, this loop that's everywhere, right? What you'll see is sometimes they'll say continuous integration, and sometimes they'll say this word called continuous testing. And the question is, well, what is that? First of all, what does that even mean? But also, this is a really good thing that development teams and DevOps teams are finally starting to recognize and put more emphasis on not just simple level, unit level integrated testing in their DevOps workflows. They're looking at how can we put back testing into our DevOps pipeline, because the thing with continuous testing and the thing with testing that we're talking about in DevOps is this: it's not, do you have test automation? That's not what we're trying to figure out here. What we're trying to figure out is how are you actually approaching your test automation? And this leads into a lot of the reports a lot of the graphs that we see around DevOps, which is, okay, we got this thing from development to production, and there's some testing that goes on here. But really what we're focused on is this thing called continuous delivery and continuous deployment. And we think that, you know, at the crux of it, all we got to do is write some unit level test automation, get it hooked into our CI, everything passes, we're good to go, right? That may be true for a lot of small changes that actually occur, but sometimes when you look at it, continuous testing actually goes across from continuous integration all the way into production. There's a staging aspect of it. There's a tear up and build down aspect of it. There's a way to do functional test automation, performance automation, and even more capability automation that goes even beyond your unit level test automation. So we need to be thinking about this word and this phrase of continuous testing, because it is something that's here to stay, and it's something that's going to be on the minds of a lot of people coming soon, which is how can we make sure that in this continuous testing area that we can get the most out of our automated testing, our exploratory testing, even some of our acceptance testing and validation testing, so that we don't halt the pipeline and we don't stop the pipeline from going forward, because we don't want to be a bottleneck anymore. We want to be an enabler, and we want to be able to be something that can empower our organizations to go off and do these things of continuous testing. So, giving you some good understanding of the industry, right? Well, what are some steps that we can take, right? What are some things we can actually take action on? And we're going to use this infinite loop again, and we're going to hone in on and give some examples across this area. We're really going to focus on the areas of planning, coding, building, and testing. And I put in some sample logos here and some sample tools just so you can kind of get the picture and understand at each of the stages what they could refer to. So with planning, you're thinking about how can I write my user stories? How can I create my epics? How can I do all this stuff in planning, right? Coding is how can I then store that in a version control system that then gets hooked into my CI, that then hooks into the rest of my testing that needs to go on, right? So we're really going to focus on this left side of the DevOps infinite loop here, and we're going to see kind of how we can optimize a lot of that in each of these areas. Okay, all right, so let's get into it. So planning state, let's talk about the planning. So the planning state really gets into multiple things. It gets into the user stories and how those connect. However, when it comes to testing, the planning that you need to be focused on is something that refers to this thing called the ideal test automation pyramid. Again, this is not something that is a prescribed way of doing things. There's all kinds of things out there that people will say, well, you know what, it's okay to have a lot of UI tests, it's okay to have a lot of integration tests. The main crux of this is that what you don't want to have is a automated testing suite that doesn't incorporate each of these levels. A lot of times it's this. A lot of times you have a lot of automated GUI tests, right? And the reason why that people do that is because it's a little bit easier than starting with unit level tests when you are a test team. When you need to get your unit level tests going, you need to talk to developers. You need to have conversations with engineers. With testers, we think, you know what? With the automated UI test, the reason why I should focus on this is because, well, I have a manual test, right? And it's easier for me to grab a manual test and go and automate that, right? Rather than trying to build this bottoms up approach for my organization and get people focused on your unit level test. So on the left side over here, this is more of a bloated way of looking at your automation that's going on, right? This is kind of an anti-pattern that you want to be aware of and make sure that you don't have so much this UI testing and not enough unit level testing. And the reason is because this, and everyone knows this, but it is, as we talk about this more and more, one of the big things is that the UI testing that goes on, it can get so overblown and so overbloated that you have a bunch of brittle tests that don't refer back to the actual UI anymore. So you can get in trouble with that if you really focus on that UI testing. It's not to say you don't focus on it, because we do have some of that in the ideal test automation pyramid, but what you're doing is you're focusing on, let's get our checks in place at the unit level and let's build up to go to API and unit level and UI, and then we can go from there. So for the first part, the planning area is looking at, okay, what types of tests are we going to do? How much are we going to do that? And where are we going to put it in our plan? The next part is looking at what can we then automate, right? When we're looking at automation, and we just did a great webinar with Adam Satterfield. He is one of the test leaders out at Anthem, Blue Cross and Blue Shield. That's at QASymphony.com if you want to go take a look at that. But what we did was we had a great conversation around metrics that matter, and it was all around your different levels of automation and where you should be focusing your automation efforts. the thing that he really kind of honed in on is that during a new sprint planning and a new sprint, kind of gearing up for your new sprint in a Scrum release cycle, what we don't do is we don't look at going, what types of tests can we automate if they're at the API level or at the UI level, right? We just go off and say, okay, we're gonna do some manual tests and we'll figure out how to do those at the end. What you need to do is figure out, based off the data you have, what types of tests are candidates for automation and prioritize those as a team to get those going. So that's the second thing you need to do. The third thing we need to do is look at getting away this old siloed approach from project management, development, testing, and operations. This is something that is very, very, basic. But the thing is, if you look back at that version 1 report that we talked about, we saw that a lot of the tools that the testers maybe use are not connected or are not recommended as a part of the global way of looking at your project management. So for example, we see a lot of people that are using HP Quality Center or HPALM that doesn't connect in using something like version 1 or Jira for project planning, right? So being able to knock down those, get those tool stacks connected is something that you can look at for having that pull in from the planning area. So talked a little bit about those. I'll kind of talk about some capabilities now and kind of why that's needed. So the first thing is visibility and testing for all teams. So dev, BA, and operations, right? Why is that needed? Well, pretty self-explanatory, but it's going to promote organizational quality culture and allows teams to remove any testing roadblocks. When your tests are referred back to and your developers can see all the testing that goes on across your BAs, across your development, and across your operations, you'll be able to remove a lot of those testing bottlenecks. Real-time updates between Jira and other systems. This is making sure that we're all working on the same version of truth. It's tougher when you're doing things day to day, right? What you want to make sure is that if something changes inside the Jira side or the version 1 side or whatever it is, you need to make sure that the planning around your test automation is reflected back against those particular artifacts. And then the last one is really looking at consolidated and customized dashboards across projects. This is something that we always hear about, information radiators, right? It's around how can I make sure the team level activities and processes get executive buy-in and also that visibility. And this is a really good segue into talking about the again, just another highlight of the webinar we just did. We have people asking us on the webinar saying, well, what if I do if my management doesn't even care about my test results? What if they don't even care about quality, right? Well, the question is okay, well, if they don't care about customization, any quality dashboards around what's going on in your pipeline, what are the things that you're doing to optimize your own team's effort in your testing? And that was something that the person had to think about, because I thought, you know what, yeah, actually I need to figure out what are some baseline reports and examples I can do in my own team. All right, the next part is looking at is the code aspect of it. Here are the things that we're seeing that are really influencing testing in DevOps, right? Lots of people are talking about AI, right? That's like the big thing that everyone talks about. You've got predictive analytics and code analysis, blah, 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 right? That's a big buzzword type of thing. And that's not just in the testing space, it's across every single industry that you are. You're doing ERP, you're doing manufacturing, whatever it is, everyone wants to talk about AI. The second part is really looking at cloud services and leveraging how to scale automation across different environments, things like that. That's where you get into talking about like load testing against the cloud, being able to use AWS to spin up services and tear it down, right? Those are also really important. But one of the big things that we really think can help out in influencing testing in DevOps is this thing called test-driven development. And if you look at a lot of the ways that teams are doing test-driven development now, you look at the State of Agile reports that have come out by version 1, it usually fluctuates around 40 to 45%. People say they actually do this, which is really important, because what you want to be able to do is have something where you're moving testing more upfront in your development process, right? So if you think about how I have testing that's done in a traditional timeline, you have your design phase in day 1, and then until day 20, you're not even really getting to test anything, right? And typically, you don't even have a lot of this referred back to the code level. A lot of times what you have is you have a test that's disconnected from the code, it's stored in some other management system, and it's not tied back to the actual code that the developer is working on. So what we want to do is actually move that testing from something that happens more at the end of a release cycle and push it and help the developers and QA engineers actually start doing that more upfront to have automated testing before it's actually put into production. And there's basically ways to do this, and test-driven development is something that a lot of people on the call maybe go, yeah, Ryan, that's great, I do test-driven development. That's not really helping me out. Well, you may be doing test-driven development, and you may be doing it really at this level, which is this, more of this unit level test-driven, more technical TDD. A lot of people think about test-driven development, think about, okay, how can I automate my unit level tests and have code coverage from a developer perspective? How can I make sure that the checks are all in bounds and everything's working, right? However, what you're not doing is really getting to give more visibility around what's actually going on in your development process and add to a TDD space that includes something like behavior-driven development. And behavior-driven development is what's been kind of on this rise nowadays to get people involved with getting more and more automation pushed more up front, but it's also a way to tie it back to the feature level of the testing that you're doing. And we don't have time to go into exactly what behavior-driven development is and all the different aspects of that. We have other webinars that talk about making the move to behavior-driven development that we can point you to. But the key thing with behavior-driven development is that you're trying to then also scale up that automation pyramid to include things beyond just the unit level testing. And that can be done by using that collaboration tool like Cucumber to help with automating your tests, but it also helps with the structure and standardization that goes into that as well. So what are the capabilities that we need to drive that test first approach adoption, right? So the first thing is in what we're going to really refer back to is looking at this BD stuff, right? Is that there's a structured syntax support for automation reuse, right? So why is that needed? So one of the great things about using BDD is that you have this common language called Gherkin that allows you to basically reuse automation, and it really reduces a lot of the maintenance and effort that goes on. That's a key thing around why people say, yeah, we use Cucumber for automation. What they're really referring to is they use Cucumber for automation, but they're also using it as a BDD methodology tool to help out with that. The next part is looking at capability for feature and scenario creation in your ALM that you're using. So if you're using something like Jira, you're using like another ALM that's out there, what you're wanting to do is say, okay, I've got the planning state done. Now the coding state, what I want to do is make sure that when I create an automated test, it refers back to that particular acceptance criteria that's on my user story, right? And then what that allows me to do is actually integrate the test into version control systems, which is the last one. So one of the big things with BDD that really helps out with a testing strategy around the planning and coding area is that you have the acceptance criteria on that ALM that you're using, but that can be pushed down into source control, which is like the number one source of truth when it comes to making sure and monitoring your DevOps pipeline. So making sure that if you have tests that fail, and if they are failing or passing, you want to make sure that refactor process is factored into the pipeline that you have. So again, here's some quick things that go on there for figuring out kind of capabilities and also what's needed. Okay, so the build part, right? Now we're into, okay, we've planned something in Jira, we've coded something using TDD, and possibly we're using something called BDD. The planning state, we've kind of hooked in some of the tools into our testing frameworks we have, right? The build state is where I feel like a lot of testers and a lot of organizations kind of break down, because this is a typical CI pipeline workflow that kind of happens here, right? And I'll kind of walk through this real quick, but you've got at the planning state we talked about, you got Jira, you got these user stories. At the code level, they're doing these commits, hopefully practicing TDD. And then in the build state, they're actually building this and having Jenkins or Bamboo kind of run this and kick this off, right? Well, after this, what usually happens is that there's a breakdown between all the other automation and all the other testing that goes on that's outside of just regular CI builds, right? A lot of times it's, hey, my unit level test passed, they're all green, they're all good to go. And as a tester, I'm going, well, wait a minute, I still have all this other ad hoc testing that I have to do. I still have performance testing I have to do. I still have functional automation that I have to do, and they're not notified and they're not aware of what's going on in the build and test area. So then what happens is you have this skip almost where you have this dialogue and you go, you know what, team A, developer team, you guys are saying it's all green. The testing team is saying, well, hold on, wait a minute. We need to run all this other testing. But since it's not connected to the build process, people are always running around going, okay, well, what do I do now? And this is always a problem when you come across testing teams that are trying to make sure and try to be ingrained into that particular pipeline. So we actually have a graph that was done, and this is kind of an architecture diagram graph that was done by one of our clients or one of our customers, Dolby Labs. And this is what they came up with, right? They said, okay, we're running thousands of automated tests a day. They were using a tool called TestLink. They don't use that anymore. And they're basically like, we need to make sure that the product team and the stakeholders in this engineering portal on the far right, they're aware of what's going on in our pipeline. And they want to make sure and have confidence that our testing team is hooked into that as well. So what they have is they have this diagram here where they have their source code in Git. That's connected in with Jenkins for CI. And then what they have is an API that pushes and pulls that data into one location. But all that data in that one location is then connected back to the planning state for requirements and defects with like Jira software. And so what they're able to do is say, okay, we're going to tie in all of our CI along with a lot of our other testing that we're doing for one location, so the developers and QA engineers have a one-stop shop where they can see that. And then they can also share that out with different engineering teams and make sure that they're all on the same page for the different types of processes that are going on. So they're able to give that early feedback and not be out of the loop and be connected in with the build process. So capabilities you need to integrate with feedback early, right? One thing we didn't talk about was having a capability of doing exploratory testing. So here's the deal. When you've got all of your tests stored with code, you've got it in a build process where it's building and you're connected and you have visibility into all the different tests that are going on, right? The other thing that you want to do is carve out time in this building state to make sure you're doing exploratory testing. And that what allows you to do is be able to give quick feedback around features that need automated tests that may be under development. That really helps out in this building state. The other thing that we're doing is we have that CI build tool integration that's already set up. So we're ingesting a lot of the results back into real time, and they're basically linking back to the stories and defects that are in Jira. So we can then proceed and consolidate that with any automated or manual tests that we need to go on. So the testers are aware that, yeah, we've got this red-green build status good to go, and we can start doing more provisioning and more testing in our staging environments. And then the last one is making sure you have customized workflows and pipeline automation. So this is where you're getting into reducing a lot of the manual work that actually happens here. So one of the big things that you're doing is you're making sure that, for example, let's say a build happened and that was connected into a channel like a Slack channel or a HIP chat channel or whatever chat ops channels you all use. It can notify the test team and say, hey, this build broke. You're either going to halt the testing you have planned for scheduled automation, or it's good to go ahead and kick off your automation and continue on, right? So being able to make sure that you have that customized workflows, make sure you have the ability to tie into that automation is going to be something that you want to have for customized workflows. Okay, so the last part is getting into the actual testing area. So the testing area is all the other testing that we have. So we've done planning, we've done the code part, we're versioning that into code. We're building a lot of unit level tests, right? But when we get to the continuous integration part, right? A lot of this is where I got back to my earlier diagram where I talked about and said, you've got people that have been removing continuous integration, replacing it with continuous testing, because there's all this other testing that you have going on at this stage, at this little sliver of this DevOps infinite loop, right? This is why a lot of people are rethinking how they're doing testing, is because they're not just looking at it purely from just, did my unit level test? It's really, what other functional automation do I have to do? What end-to-end automation is going on? What types of security or performance testing need to happen before we feel like we're ready to go and take off into production, right? That all needs to be a part of your testing strategy. And the way you deal that is to build what we have is like a testing umbrella, right? And what we mean by that is you have a plan in place that outside of the unit level test you're doing, you're factoring in all the other testing that needs to occur. And what it may look like is broken up into something like this. And this is a pretty common thing that you'll see in organizations. But let's say you have customer facing applications and you have a more technical team. They're probably going to be focused a lot on open source test automation, right? If the further you go to internal customer facing and less technical, you're getting into more commercial tools, you're getting into more homegrown tools, you're getting into tools for automation that are further away from open source, because you need to have people that are more technical to run with open source, right? So the problem though with this is saying, okay, we've got this test umbrella, we've got a test plan and all this other test cycles we have kind of laid out for all the different testing that we're going to be doing. We need to also support that with an automation freeway. And what we mean by automation freeway is this, and this is done by Brian Osterkamp. He is from USAA, and he did this webinar on what to do when everyone wants to use a different automation tool. So this is very important, because what was happening is that in their organization, they had every day, like every week, they had some new engineering team, some new development team come to them and say, hey, we want to use this area or this automation tool in our DevOps model, and that's what we want to do, right? Well, the problem was when they did that, they always had issues around maintaining that automation going forward and then socializing it with other people. And so what they did was they said, you know what, here's what we're going to do. We're going to create this automation freeway where we're going to help and stand up and enable our new engineering teams to come on, our new testing teams to come on, whatever their application is. We want to enable them to be able to get up and running as soon as we can through this thing called this automation freeway. So they actually have a whole department dedicated to training, supporting, being able to deploy different templates and packages whenever they select the tool, and also give all the reporting and compliance when they say, yeah, we want to use JMeter for performance automation. We want to use Ready API for API testing. For unit level testing, we want to use TestNG, right? End to end, we're going to use Sauce Labs. They have all these things packaged up for them to get them going and get them going relatively quickly. However, if they want to use a different testing tool, that's okay. They can get off the freeway, but what they're going to lose is all this training and support that they have with that department in their organization. So what it does is it creates a safe barrier for people to get going and get going fast with test automation by having this training and support kind of set up here. But it also gives them the creativity to veer off if they need to. If they want to test out the latest, testing framework that seems like it comes up every week. We have a new testing framework that's out there on the support forums, right? That's one thing that you should do to help your teams out, which is, yes, you can do whatever you want, but here's our support for you as it stands today. And if you have more and more adoption with a newer tool that you have, we can then package that possibly in the future and have that a part of our automation freeway. But we really want to help you and get going here, right? So those are kind of some of the benefits around testing and how you can take that away and really go off and build this out, a part of your team around the different tools to support. Okay, so wrapping it up, right? So let's wrap up kind of what we talked about, and I'm gonna do a little bit different here and actually go by industry tactic, benefit, and then the suggested test strategy that we've been talking about this whole time in this topic today. So the first thing is making sure that version control practices and tools are in place for change control, right? Everyone is either moving from, if you're on Subversion, you're looking at using some form of Git possibly now. The reason is because you've got this source code that equals a single truth of record really of what's going on. And the test strategy on top of that, if you look at the tactic, the strategy is then to go, okay, well, we need to version our test with code to be incorporated with CI builds, going beyond the unit level testing and putting it into the CI process with versions to the code base. The next part and next industry tactic we see here is to facilitate better collaboration between product dev, test operations, all these things we talked about from a planning perspective, right? That's making sure that everyone is aware and is locked in on that everyone's job, everyone really cares about quality. There is no siloed approach anymore. We've got that kind of locked in. And the test strategy of that is making sure your ALM systems of record have that continuous developer feedback, right? Whether it's a real-time integration with Jira, or it's using a bridge system to do that, you want to make sure that you've got those tools hooked in together. The third part is looking at building a test automation strategy into continuous testing process, right? This, again, getting back to this is the big part where you're saying testing is now part of the development process, and it's integral to our DevOps organizations. We're not going to settle with just saying, yeah, unit level testing pass. We need to make sure we have the right mix of unit, API, UI testing that's incorporated with that. And then that's actually put into the CI process along with any scheduled functional automation that goes on. This is a pretty common thing where it's, we get asked all the time is, we have the CI process that runs, but then we run tests outside of CI. How do we accomplish that, and how do we help with that? That's another discussion for another day, but that's one of the things that we talk to on a daily basis with customers. The next thing is looking at shifting quality and test automation in front of your development process, right? We talked about test-driven development, behavior-driven development, right? Being able to catch bugs earlier and automate tests earlier, right? The test strategy for that would then look into open source automation like Cucumber for shift left success, right? So again, not everyone is going to be doing BDD. There's only around, I think it's around 16 to 18% of organizations say they actually do behavior-driven development, which means they probably use a tool like Cucumber for that. But really, it's coming down to is, can we shift quality left for that? And the last part is just making sure you're matching up an automation test strategy, people, process, and tools, being able to enable best of breed automation, and having a free, automation free way to facilitate adoption and standardization. So that's kind of to wrap it up of what we talked about today. And I want to show you, before we get to Q&A, just different types of webinars you can go and look at that kind of relate back to this one. So on our website, you can go and look and find, we've got things around that webinar I talked about was around what to do when everyone wants to have a different test automation tool. We've got continuous integration, how it affects testing. That's one that's done by Paul Merrill, a big leader in the automation or test automation industry. We've got a panelist on software testing in the real world, and looking into like digital disruption, how quality fits into digital transformation, things like that. That's another good webinar to go to as well. So we've got a lot of good stuff there for you, and I know we've got about 5 minutes or so for questions. So let's go ahead and hand it off to Charlene to get everyone to start putting in more and more questions.
Yeah, guys. So as Ryan said, we do have about 5 or 7 minutes or so for Q&A. So if you do have a question for Ryan, go ahead and use your GoToWebinar control panel, submit your question, and hopefully we'll be able to get to them. Ryan, I'm going to actually push it back over to you so you can take a look at the questions and do the Q&A.
Great, thanks. Well, thanks. Craig told me that he really liked the webinar, so thanks, Craig. I liked being here. I really enjoyed kind of hanging out with all of you all today. So one of the questions is, we're looking at, somebody was asking about, what is, I said BDD a lot. The question is, what is BDD? I don't understand. What is Cucumber, right? So at a high level, right, here's what it is. So BDD is behavior-driven development. It is a testing. It's a development methodology. It's not a testing per se, a testing methodology, right? One of the big things that you have, right, is the fact that everyone wants to figure out how to do more and more test automation. But the problem a lot of times is you go from manual tests to automated scripted tests, and you lose a lot of the connection between that. And so what BDD does is that it incorporates test automation a part of what's being actually developed. And so you're testing the code that you're developing at the same time you're running automated tests. And so you have to be pretty technical to understand kind of how BDD works. Cucumber is actually just a framework that sits on top of that. Okay, so we got some other questions coming in here. Let me go ahead and pull these up here and give it a read. Okay, so let's go to, oops, sorry. A lot of questions here. Okay, so question is, how do you solve the test script maintenance problem in longer scripts? So this is a good question, and this is a question I feel like a lot of people are not able to do, and quite honestly, it's a very hard thing to do. But here's what you do. Here's one of the big triggers or the big things to make sure that you are going back to and looking at a test script that needs maintenance, right? The thing is this, is that a lot of times you have test scripts that have maintenance that are disconnected with the code. That's one of the biggest things that's out there. You have test automation, it's on a server, you've got a bunch of QTP scripts or something like that, it's on some type of server and you're running it. And the problem is that that's not connected with any code change that happens maybe in something like GitHub. And so the key thing that you want to make sure is that, can you set up workflows and automation and automated connectors that say, this code change, I know this code change, I know that refers back to this particular requirement, possibly in something in Jira. Well, that requirement actually refers back to this automation script, and then you're able to do the tracing back to and get alerts around that. That's the best way that I've seen around that, and actually seen that we have a lot of the things that are out there. Like, that's like a big thing that I see in the industry, is just like tying more of your tests that you're doing back to source code that your developers really want to work in. That's a better way to go about with that maintenance of script. Okay, got a lot of questions coming in here. Question is, would it be possible to create a CI/CD pipeline with manual tests? The answer is yeah, that's absolutely true. And I'll go back to what I just said, which is that if you have your tests, again, the problem a lot of people have is that they aren't storing their tests with code, right? If you think about it, I have a manual test, right? How do I connect it to the CI/CD pipeline? Well, the main thing you want to do is, if your test is in something like Excel or it's in a Google Doc, right? It's never, ever, ever going to get connected to the CI pipeline if it's not code, right? So you're able, like, for example, if you have a manual test, you can actually store that inside of GitHub, right? You can store that in there, put in some falses or trues whenever you find things, and that can be read by your CI tool to say, yeah, this is broke or this has been fixed. So you can definitely do that, but again, it always goes back to making sure that's pushed into the CI pipeline there. Okay, so let's go back to some other questions. Trying to hit these like really fast. I know we got a lot going on here. Okay, question is, what is the future of BDD in Agile and Cucumber versus, I think it says GOSP. I'm pretty sure you meant maybe Gauge, and which is best for BDD. So Gauge is something that came out from ThoughtWorks. It's a newer behavior-driven development type framework that's out there. It was in beta for about a year or so, I believe, and now it's actually released into the public. What's cool about Gauge is it's got this thing called Markdown format when you're actually doing your testing. So it's a little looser than using something like the Gherkin syntax for Cucumber. But to answer your question, that kind of gives you an idea of just a little bit difference of how they're a little bit different. But the cool thing about where I see BD going in the Agile space is it's gotten bigger and bigger and bigger ever since it got produced back in 2006. So back in 2006, Dane North came out with it, and it was actually, I think it was built off of JUnit, I think at the time. They didn't even have Ruby or anything like that with Cucumber. And what happened was, up until like 2009, it was like kind of going well, and then it was fine. And then you saw this big jump from like 2009 all the way to like 2018. And so if you look back at the state of Agile reports from version 1, I think back in 2009, it was around 8 or 9%. And now it's all the way up to like 16 or 17%. So it's actually doubled, almost more than doubled of what the adoption is for BDD. And what's interesting is you see a lot of tools that are out there. ALM Octane is a tool that is really trying to get into BDD. HIP Test is a tool that is really trying to show off BDD capabilities. QA Symphony has a product called QTest Scenario that is embedded inside your ALM with Jira for BDD collaboration. So it's a lot of tools and vendors are actually getting on this BDD train, at least giving people the option to do that. One thing I will say though is that even though the adoption rate's gone up, it's not pervasive in a lot of industries. It's mostly focused in financial services industries, and a lot of it is done over in the UK side. So a lot of companies we talk with, a lot of large banks in the UK, they're doing BDD. They really want to do BDD versus a traditional way of doing test automation. Okay, so I told you I'd give you 5 minutes left, so I'm going to answer one more question. Let's go here to... Okay, question is, what should I learn in AI to improve testing? Okay, so if we're talking about using AI in your testing process, one of the big things that we're seeing is the amount of data that AI. So first, I would say this. First of all, AI is still very immature, right? It's still very. If you go to a lot of these conferences that are out there, you'll be talking about AI. They'll be talking about AI a lot, but it could mean multiple things. It could mean predictive analytics. It could be risk-based analysis. It could be machine learning, right? So what I would do is this, is I would, to get a better understanding and to actually improve testing, I would do this. I would go and make sure anytime that you're thinking about artificial intelligence, that you're classifying and you're clarifying all the different aspects of that. And there's a lot of really good books out there, and a lot of good blogs that are out there as well, that kind of walk you through what AI is according to those different categories. Because AI could be 5 things, but in a testing context, a lot of it is really referred to the predictive part of analytics and how can we do better test planning and test authoring and also test execution based off all the data that we've pulled together. So in that short amount of time that I have to kind of give you that answer, I would say that go off and make sure you're understanding the different facets and columns of what AI is in that process. So I think we're right up on time. So I'll pass it back to Charlene to kind of close this out.
Okay, great. Well, echoing Craig's comment, that was a great webinar. I got a lot out of it. I'm sure our audience did as well. So thank you, Ryan. That was really, really interesting. So today's webinar, just a reminder, today's webinar has been recorded. So if you missed any or all of the presentation, you will be able to access the webinar on demand. We're going to be sending out an email sometime within the next 24 hours that has a link to the webinar on demand that you can access it there. The webinar is also going to be living on the DevOps.com website. So if for some reason you don't get the link or it's not working or whatever, just go to the DevOps.com website. Look under the webinars section. We have a list of upcoming webinars and webinars on demand. So take a look. Maybe there'll be 1 or 2 others that pique your interest. Ryan, again, thank you for your time today. It was a great presentation, and thank you to the audience. And thank you to the audience for joining me today. And this is Charlene O'Hanlon signing off. Have a great day, everybody.